All right, I think we can get things started now. So good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you all here today. Today happens to be World Snake Day. World Snake Day was created to raise awareness about snakes and their role in different ecosystems around the world. And today we're here to learn about one of the largest and most elusive groups of snakes, venomous snakes on the planet, Bushmasters. And here to teach us about those snakes is Dr. Chris Jenkins. Chris is the CEO of the Orion Society. We're a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to the conservation of habitat of imperiled reptiles and amphibians. And Chris is also a member of the International Union for Conservation of Nature Snake Specialist Group, as well as a co-founder of the Viper Specialist Group. And with that, I will turn the floor over to him.
Great. Thank you, Kylie. You can hear me okay?
We can still hear you.
Perfect. Well, happy World Snake Day to everybody. Not a holiday to everybody, but those of us that appreciate snakes, it's a special day, and I'm happy to be here with all of you. I'm going to give a presentation on Bushmasters. We'll talk about a number of different aspects of the natural history, ecology, some of the landscapes that they live in, and talk about some of the threats that they're currently facing. And I would encourage you all, if you have questions or comments, feel free to put those in the chat. And then after I finish the presentation, Kylie will kind of facilitate the answering of those or any discussion around those. So to kick it off, I'm excited, going to talk to you today about what I see as truly one of the most amazing animals on the planet. I mean, Bushmasters, certainly, I mean, if I was cornered and asked what my favorite snakes were or favorite animals on the planet, it'd be it'd be between Bushmasters and timber rattlesnakes. And I've just had this fascination with them for as long as I've been interested in snakes. And hopefully I can kind of illustrate why that is today, and hopefully teach you guys a little bit about this animal and what they're facing. So, but to talk about Bushmasters, we really need to talk about, hold on, I'm having issues advancing my slides. Oh, here we go. Let's try this. There, that'll work. So we really need to talk about the places that they live. The story of the various Bushmaster species is really a story of some of the most wild places that we have left on the planet. And these would be the rainforest regions in the Americas and in Central and South America specifically. So you can imagine places like Corcovado National Park in Costa Rica. You could imagine, the Amazon basin and what used to be, the Atlantic forests on the coast of Brazil. Just these, seemingly never-ending landscapes, incredibly lush, a lot of rain, incredible biodiversity. Their story is so tightly coupled with these places, and these places in a very wild, untouched state. And we'll talk about that as we get into this. And their stories linked to so many other forms of wildlife that also kind of depend on those intact rainforests. Everything from amazing animals such as this tapir that you see here on a Bushmaster trip that I had a handful of years ago now. I remember I was in Costa Rica and I was walking up this small ridge just off the coast, and we were looking for snakes, and all of a sudden there was this commotion coming down the ridge in front of us. And all of a sudden we didn't see this animal till it was about 10 feet from us, but this giant tapir just kind of came out and ended up walking literally about 10 feet from us, and then went down to the shore, and we followed it along the beaches. So again, Bushmasters, they live in these places that are some of the most wild, that still have just these wildlife populations that you don't see in a lot of places that are more disturbed. Places where you have intact primate communities that are living all through the forest canopy, and colorful birds like macaws flying through the air. Even places where you have intact predator communities, large predator communities, things like jaguars that are out actively, hunting the forests, or things like black caiman that, are in these river systems and wetlands in the Amazon, and are hunting those. And so if we come back to our Bushmaster here, I mean, in my mind, this animal is every bit as magnificent, every bit just a symbol of these wild rainforests, as you would say something like a jaguar or a tapir would be. And you'll see here, and you probably know, but the Latin, the genus name for Bushmasters is Lachesis, which loosely translates into disposer of fate, and that is inevitably linked to the perception and the reality that the venom, the bite of this animal can be quite deadly to humans. And to give you a little bit of insight into the origins of that name, we have to go back to Greek mythology and talk about three sisters. And the first one being Clotho. And she is the one that is there at the beginning of a human's life. And, in this depiction of the three sisters, you can see her on the left there. Kind of building the thread, making the thread, essentially, the birth of that person. And then you have Lachesis, and she's the second sister. And what she does is she measures the thread of our lives. So in this mythology, she's the one that decides if we're only going to live to be a 5-year-old and something is going to happen, or if we're going to live to be in our 90s. So she makes the decision on how long that thread of our lives as humans are. And then her sister Atropos then is the one who ends up cutting that thread and actually causing the death. So obviously the genus for this species, Lachesis, is linked to that concept of how life-threatening a bite from this animal, and also the perception. And we'll talk about some of that. Don't get me wrong, it is a very life-threatening bite, but in some ways I think it is over-exaggerated. And so, that name certainly has something to do with this sister from Greek mythology who is going to actually measure the length of our lives, and I guess insinuating that the Bushmaster has that kind of power and control over our lives. And if so, we look at Bushmasters. The first thing I'll tell you is that the taxonomy of these species is getting revised, and there will be further revisions. And I have no claim or any stake in how the species are split, but I will tell you that there are currently thought to be 4 species of Bushmasters, one of them having a subspecies designation within it. And if you look at this recent map from the publication I have there in the upper right, you'll see the distribution of these species. And we'll start in the top left with Lachesis stenophrys, which is more commonly known as the Central American Bushmaster. And if you look in this inset, this blow up, you can see that the Central American Bushmaster primarily occurs on the Caribbean side of Costa Rica, and then down through the Caribbean side of Western Panama. And then we have the second species, Lachesis melanocephala, which is known as the black-headed Bushmaster. And this Bushmaster, as you can see in this inset with the gray polygon here, this Bushmaster species also lives in Costa Rica. It very likely can be found just over into Panama, but it, unlike the Central American, which is on the Caribbean side, the black-headed has a fairly restricted range on the Pacific side of Costa Rica, down in the I guess it would be the southwest portion of the country, encompassing places like the Osa Peninsula and the foothills of the Talamanca Range. Then when we come down, if we go back to the main map here and we come off of Central America and we come into South America, we have Lachesis acrocorda, and this is more commonly known as the Chacoan Bushmaster, and they live in that Chaco region of basically of Colombia, northern Ecuador, along the coast, and even getting into eastern Panama. And then the final species is Lachesis muta, and that is found we'll just call it the greater Amazon basin. And then there's a subspecies within that group that is found only along those Atlantic Brazilian forests that I was mentioning earlier. And we'll talk quite a bit about that region later when we get into some of the threats and conservation, because that's a real critical area for the survival of that subspecies. So if we look at Bushmasters, just in terms of identifying them and how they look, they actually have a fairly distinct pattern. As many of you know, in these rainforests, many of them have incredibly diverse snake communities. However, there's really the Bushmaster is fairly unique. You can see that they kind of have this base background color that's typically some version of beige or cream colored to orange, and they have these very distinct black pattern, like we'll call them chevrons, but this black pattern that goes the length of the body. And you also see that black continues onto the head, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. One thing I'll point out here, but you'll see better in the next picture, is if you look across the back here where my arrow's pointing, you can see that the scales look like they have quite a bit of texture, and they do. Bushmasters have like a keeled scale, like many vipers, many the rattlesnakes you think of here in the U.S., but especially on the top, or the back of the Bushmaster, those scales and that texture to them are very distinct and very sharp, and that probably serves a number of purposes. One being what a lot of keeled scale snakes probably have. It's another form of camouflage. You can think of the analogy, let's just say you're a deer hunter and you're going to wear a regular camouflage shirt, or you're going to wear one of those like leafy suit camouflage shirts. The texture adds to the color in terms of the camouflage, and that's certainly one function of it. But we'll talk a little bit later when we're talking about reproduction in Bushmasters. We'll talk about again another real fascinating use of those scales. So sticking with kind of identifying the snake, again here I want to really point out this closer view of these really accentuated keeled scales. And then the other thing I'd point out, but I don't like to think of it as just a key characteristic for Bushmasters, but you'll notice this red eye. A lot of the Bushmasters you'll see will have a red eye. I don't think of it as completely diagnostic, because there are other snakes that can have red eyes, and you'll see Bushmasters that don't appear to have red eyes, or they're much, much darker. But that is a trait you will often see in Bushmasters. They will have kind of that red eye, and they have that, kind of that elliptical pupil there, like you see in a lot of vipers. But again, that's not diagnostic. As many of you probably know, the pupils can change shapes. So really the best way to identify them, they are fairly unique. I like to say, when I'm talking about identification of snakes, it's not learning to identify them based on all these little features. It's learning to recognize them if you're in a place, so you can just simply look at one and realize that is a Bushmaster. Okay, so here's another shot of a Bushmaster, and I want to point out in this bigger picture in the background, the head pattern here. I mentioned that earlier, and there, in terms of looking at the different species of Bushmasters that exist There will be some variation in the color on the head, but I would say the only one that is really diagnostic is the black-headed bushmaster that you see down here in the bottom left in this inset. And that, the black-headed bushmaster, as you would expect with the name, they have this very black, dark colored, solid head. They all have these very fine scales that you see, but the other species, the Central American, the Chicoan, the South American species, they have some pattern on their head, and it can vary amongst those, but it's very subtle and not as diagnostic. So there can also be some slight size differences among the species, but in general, they look very similar. The black-headed bushmaster being the only one with that real diagnostic characteristic between the four of them. There are a number of species that they occur with that could easily get confused with a bushmaster, but again, I think they're distinct enough. If you learn to recognize them instead of trying to pick apart small features to identify them, it's a very easy thing. So here you see in the bottom left, you see one of the Bothrops species. These are things like fertile ants, and then the bottom right, you see one of the hognose vipers. So this is the genus Porthidium, and both of those groups, I guess look somewhat similar, but really, when you start to see them or you start to research them and look at a lot of pictures, they're really quite different. The other thing I'd say is that bushmasters, first of all, are not as common as a species like a fertile ants, and even in places where they are as common, they're not going to be as detectable. Meaning, they're not on the surface active, moving around as much. Whereas something like a fertile ants, if you go down to many places in the tropics, this is actually going to be one of the most common snakes you see. And it's actually worth mentioning seeing snakes in the rainforest in general. For those of you that have not been there, I've gone down to various rainforests over the years. And, I think a lot of people have this vision of like, just kind of snakes hanging off the trees, that they're just snakes everywhere, and that's certainly not the case. You can go to the rainforest and have a very productive time looking for snakes and see a lot of species, but it is again, they aren't just everywhere. There's incredible diversity. You need to target how you look for them. Typically going out at night, you're going to find a much greater diversity of species. So it's also the other thing I'd say, if you're looking for snakes in the tropics as compared to say up here in the temperate regions of North America, it's also a lot harder to like target particular species. Whereas like, say you were looking for timber rattlesnakes up in northeastern US, there are ways to target relatively large numbers of snakes. It's very difficult to do that with most species in these tropical rainforests. You kind of go out on an adventure and you may key in on some habitats, but generally you're going to find a handful of species that you may or may not have expected. So the other thing that really makes the bushmaster stand out, and I guess it could be a characteristic that helps you identify them, but they are the longest viper in the world. They're one of the largest vipers overall in the world. As you can see from this picture, this animal's quite long, and I don't remember the exact record, but I know it's over 12 feet. So they can get to be, really quite large snakes. And that puts them in very interesting company as some of the largest vipers in the world, with animals like you see here on the top. The top is a gaboon viper. This is a giant viper from Africa, which, as you can tell from this picture, this is a very hefty individual. That these animals, they're the heaviest vipers in the world, and they can get quite a bit of girth to them. And one thing that may be surprising to some folks, one of the other top sized vipers in the world is right here in North America, in the Southeast where I live. And it's the eastern diamondback rattlesnake on the bottom. And so while they don't get as long as bushmasters, the maximum length for a diamondback is going to be somewhere in the ballpark of 7 feet. They, like the gaboon viper, can get an incredible amount of girth and become really heavy animals. Okay, so now I want to transition a little bit and talk about, just some of the kind of natural history and ecological aspects of bushmasters. And I'll start off by saying, first of all, some of these are going to be generalities. Like for example, when we talk about kind of the reproductive cycle and the timing of that, there are some generalities there. And the other thing I'd say is that bushmasters overall are a relatively understudied. We know very little about this species as compared to some snake species. So there's really is a lot that we don't know. But I'm going to tell you what we do know. The first thing I'd tell you is, as I mentioned in the introduction when I was talking about rainforests, is that they live in primary and secondary rainforests. There are exceptions, but in general, this is a snake that likes really undisturbed, oftentimes old growth type rainforest habitat. And so these rainforests are obviously very humid and hot. Maybe not quite as hot as you'd imagine if you're there. The rain kind of gives it a cool feeling at times, but usually temperatures would be hovering somewhere in the 80-degree range. And some of these places could get up to 180 inches of rain, in a year. So they're just really, really wet. One thing that a lot of people don't realize is that many, I should say, of our rainforests around the world, including those rainforests that the bushmasters live in, are classified on some form of a rainy, dry season type pattern, where there are times of the year that will be more wet and times it'll be more dry. And oftentimes a lot of animals will kind of time certain aspects, say, of their reproduction or other things around these patterns. And I can't give a distinct pattern for the range of the genus Lachesis, because those patterns change. For example, in the Amazon and Costa Rica, the rainy dry season pattern, varies somewhat. But to give you an example, in the Amazon basin, your wettest months are going to be centered around the spring, and then the other part of the year is going to be dry in a relative sense. These rainforests, if you haven't been there, incredibly lush, dominated by broadleaf vegetation. You see, some evergreen type trees, but generally dominated by broadleaf, and are just generally characterized by incredible biodiversity. In some of these places like the Amazon, I mean, there are literally millions of species, just incredible places to visit. And when you're in these rainforests and you're looking for bushmasters, the kind of the microhabitats that you might, would be most likely to encounter them would be where you might expect, at the base of some of these relatively large old growth type trees. Oftentimes you can find them coiled around other forms of structure, like if there's some type of like a downed log or something like that. And when we get into talking about foraging, I'll give you another kind of key area that can be a good place to find bushmasters. And one aspect of their ecology is that they are primarily nocturnal. And as I was talking about earlier, when I was talking about going to rainforests to look for snakes, a lot of your snakes in the rainforest are much more active, kind of either crepuscular, say dawn and dusk, and then into the evening. And bushmasters are the same. They're most active at night. But oftentimes we'll talk about it as we move on and start talking about feeding, but bushmasters also spend a lot of time very sedentary on the surface. And so, obviously they're not necessarily retreating into, say, underground burrows, during the day. I mean, sometimes they can, and they do spend a lot of time in burrows overall. But you certainly can have bushmasters surface active, but your probability of just finding them moving around through the rainforest drops off significantly during the day. And here I'm going to show a picture that kind of blows all these things out of the water, but the idea of a bushmaster moving in the middle of the day in a very disturbed landscape, because again, those things are generalities. They're they're generally true, meaning the animals are more nocturnally active, and they are more tied to relatively undisturbed habitats. But I wanted to show this picture because it, illustrates, how the animals move. And the first thing I would say when we talk about movement is that we have very little information on like things such as like the home range that a bushmaster would use, like the total area that they would use. We have had transmitters in a couple snakes in Costa Rica, and there's another group that's doing some really great work right now, also in Costa Rica, and the people in other places working on some of this. But as it stands, we don't have a great idea of things such as bushmaster home ranges, if they go to certain places at certain times of year. So those aspects of their movement. But if we think about how bushmasters physically move an individual animal, here you see one moving across this road, and they primarily move using this slithering style that you would traditionally think of many snakes moving. But they are also very capable, being such large snakes, of a type of movement called rectilinear movement, which is something you would probably most often see in your really large snakes, and things like boas and pythons. And I won't get into the details of what's happening, but basically you could picture a snake basically laying out straight, and using rectilinear movement, they're able to move in a straight line, usually very slowly, but without kind of bending and arcing their body. So they're just moving in a straight line forward, which could have value. Say you're trying to sneak up on a prey item or something like that. I mean, bushmasters are primarily sit and wait predators, but there is value, and certainly some of your pythons and boas use that rectilinear movement, as they're foraging. Okay, so let's just say we have a bushmaster out moving through these rainforests. I want to talk a little bit about their senses and how they're experiencing the environment. And certainly, and this is true for most snakes, that their go-to sense. And when I say that, you can think of us, think of humans. Like if you like smell something or you hear something, your reaction, you feel something, your reaction is going to be to look at it. So when I say your go-to sense, I mean that like that is your primary sense. So we always focus on our sight. If we sense something another way, in almost every situation, we're going to try to look at it. So snakes, their primary, and bushmasters, their primary sense is one that we don't exactly have, but it's similar to what we have. And what they're doing is using this organ called the Jacobson's organ, and they're using their tongue, and their tongue is going out into the environment. All of you have probably seen snakes tongue flicking, and they're picking up chemicals in the environment, whether they be in the air, off surfaces, and they're running that back across this Jacobson's organ, and that's sending information about the chemicals that they pick up in the environment into their brain. And what we know about that is that it's incredibly, I don't know if accurate's the right word, maybe more like acute, in that, these animals, this is how they're deciding where to set up and forage. They're able to, say, distinguish things like how heavy a mammal trail's being used. Say there's two mammal trails and one's being used twice as much as another one. This sense that we're talking about here, most snakes would be able to detect that and make decisions based on that. They can probably sense all kinds of things. They can probably sense if you walked through an hour before, in boots, they probably sense that on a trail, or a bird landed here 2 days ago, whatever it might be, but just really acute kind of chemoreception, where they're picking up those chemicals on their tongue and they're running it across this Jacobson organ, and then transmitting that information to the brain, and then they can make decisions on what to do based on that. And I say that to lead into foraging. And so, like many vipers, our rattlesnakes here in the US are doing the same. These sit and wait predators, they'll use those senses, and they will kind of survey their environment, and Bushmasters are doing that as well. They're surveying these rainforest environments, and they're looking for areas where they want to focus their foraging, and then they will set up in those areas and assume the sit and wait. So if you think of here in the States, a lot of you can probably picture like a timber rattlesnake, and setting up on a foraging posture with its head kind of pointed up up to the top of a log, and it's kind of coiled on the side of that log. That's because that timber rattlesnake has probably inevitably sensed that a lot of, say, chipmunks or whatever it might be are running across that log, so it sets up there. And Bushmasters do the same thing in setting up their foraging sites. Another aspect which I want to talk about relative to foraging with Bushmasters is this heat sensing pit. And a lot of you probably know what this is, but here on the front of the snake's nostril, we have, the actual nostril, and the snake does smell in that way. But here they have this heat sensing pit. And basically what this pit is, it's characteristic of all the subfamily that's made up of the pit vipers. And it's basically kind of a concave cavity. And within that cavity is a series of infrared receptors. And then those infrared receptors, or the nerve coming from the pit, goes with the nerve from the eye and goes into the brain. And so we don't know for sure, but we do think that pit vipers like this see in some combination of like what we think of as sight in the color spectrum, and then the infrared or color spectrum or heat. And so we don't know if it's like this, but I like to give the analogy. If any of you are as old as me and you remember these Arnold Schwarzenegger movies with Predator and that alien creature, and how that creature saw the landscape kind of with like kind of bright reds for warm things and blues for cool things, there's a good chance that these snakes see in some type of similar fashion. So you can imagine these big rainforest environments, and the snake finds this perfect foraging area, and it sets up against the tree, and it's got a travel route for a spiny rat, and it's hunting at night, and that rat comes through at night. You can imagine that rat is going to be giving off a lot more heat than the surrounding environment, and the snake will be able to see that rat better and be able to strike it more accurately. So it's an important feeding adaptation that all of these pit vipers have developed. And so if we think, or we talk more about their diets, so Bushmasters are mammal eaters. There are some vipers that have these diverse diets where, they might even have like an ontogenic shift, or a shift as they grow older, where maybe they're young and they're eating something, and then as they get bigger, they eat other types of things. But in general, Bushmasters eat primarily mammals, and they typically will eat a small number of relatively large meals a year. A couple of the references you'll see in the literature, somewhere between 5 and 6 meals a year. And one really interesting thing, a number of vipers do this, and some of you may have seen it if you have vipers as pets or seen it in the wild, but Bushmasters oftentimes will hold their prey more so than other vipers would, especially if those prey items are relatively small. So a Bushmaster sitting in a foraging position, a relatively small prey item comes by, and they strike it, but instead of just injecting the venom and releasing, they actually grab it and they hold it in their mouths and continue to inject that venom. They also, especially with larger prey items, like you think of with most vipers, they will strike the prey and then release quickly, which minimizes any injury that they could get from that prey item as it dies. And then that prey item goes off. And there have been experimental studies where people have looked at Bushmasters' ability to track down that prey item that they've injected with venom. And similar to what we've seen with some of the rattlesnake species, some of the other vipers, is that they can be very effective at tracking down that prey item to where it's died, and that they're actually using the scent or the chemical signature of their own venom to track that down, as opposed to the chemical signature of the rodent. Because you can imagine in one of these rainforest environments that you're going to have the chemical signature of spiny rats, say, everywhere. And so, but their venom signature is much more unique in that environment. And so, again, experimentally, they've shown, like with many of the rattlesnakes, that they use their own venom signature to then track down that prey item they've killed. On the field study that Harry Green did with Central American Bushmasters, he found that once they were kind of in these areas that they were foraging, that they would move, say 5 to 20 meters. If you're not familiar with meters, think of yards or somewhat close. And they would kind of make these small movements to different kind of foraging stations, but they might stay at those sites for days or even weeks. I talked to a colleague once who had found a Bushmaster coiled up in a foraging position in the rainforest. This is down in South America, and repeatedly visited that snake, just kind of checking on him. And I can't remember the exact length of time, but the snake was sitting in one place for weeks. I want to say somewhere in the ballpark of a month. And when he finally went back and that snake had moved, the place where the snake was sitting was just so worn down. The grasses and little plants that were under there were dead and crushed, so indicating that this snake was sitting in one place. And so, I mean, it's definitely the strategy of a Bushmaster. They're a classic sit and wait predator, and again, they might wait in a good foraging area for days or potentially weeks. So let's talk about their diet. I've already mentioned it's made up almost exclusively of mammals, but even within that, the largest chunk of their diet would be what I already mentioned, the spiny rats. And spiny rats are a very diverse group of animals that are found throughout these tropical forests in Central and South America. And there's different species that are different sizes. But this probably largely because of the abundance of them, but this would be one of their primary food items. And a lot of these spiny rats, this one I think is Tome's spiny rat. This is a relatively large one, and they have a diverse diet themselves, but they really like big fruits. So you see in the picture there in the top left, the fruits of this palm, and so you'll find trees like this that are producing a lot of fruit in the rainforests, and then you'll have relatively high prey densities. And so another place that you might stand a higher probability of finding a Bushmaster in a place that they would use would be these types of areas where the spiny rats are spending quite a bit of time feeding, because again, the snake is going to be moving through the rainforest looking for foraging sites. And if you have an area like this where a lot of spiny rats are feeding, it certainly seems like a place where you would set up if you were a Bushmaster to forage. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the venom. I don't usually like to show pictures of snakes like this, but snakes do strike. But I prefer to show snakes in kind of their natural behaviors, the behaviors they do most. But I did want to show you the fangs. Bushmasters have some of the largest fangs of any snake in the world. They're not the largest. The gaboon viper that we talked about earlier, that African giant, real heavy viper, they have the longest fangs of any species. But their fangs are like other vipers. They're selenoglyphic, which basically means that they're kind of hinged up by the roof of the Bushmaster's mouth. And when the Bushmaster's mouth is closed, those are actually kind of folded up into the roof of the mouth. And then when the Bushmaster goes to strike, they open their mouth and those fangs swing out on those hinges and will kind of point straight forward as they strike towards that prey. And I'm going to talk about venom, not in great depth from a human perspective, but I'm going to talk about some of the highlights here. I will say this is the aspect of Bushmasters that is most well known. So if you're very interested in venom and, you know, just kind of impacts to humans and all of that, this is the area with Bushmasters that we know the most. And so you can easily do a much deeper dive if you'd like. But I will tell you, like vipers in general, that their venom is for feeding. It's not derived as a defensive venom like you might see, say, in like a Gila monster or a beaded lizard. I mean, these are feeding adaptations. But a Bushmaster bite is very life-threatening, and there are a number of places you can start looking up the statistics. I won't go through them now, but you know, a good percentage of people who receive Bushmaster bites will die, a good percentage, more so than a lot of species. But interestingly, I will say, if you look at the toxicity of the venom, meaning like on a drop by drop basis, there are many species that are actually more toxic drop for drop. You would be surprised at some of those species. But the issue is that the Bushmaster, being the longest, one of the largest vipers in the world, they can deliver such an incredible venom load that, you know, that's one of the primary reasons that it can be such a life-threatening bite. The venom's kind of diverse. You know, there are different kind of types within it. You get very hemorrhagic types in it that create, you know, a lot of hemorrhaging, a lot of tissue and muscle breakdown. You'll also see a lot of coagulants in there. So it'll cause the blood of whatever they've injected to coagulate. And there are some neurotoxic components in it that affect your nervous system. And the bites are kind of interesting based on, I've never had one, but based on what I've read, in that the initial stages of a Bushmaster bite, it would be very similar, say, to like a Fertilance bite or another Bothrops species bite, in that there'd be a lot of like tissue breakdown and hemorrhaging. But then, unlike a lot of those bites, the Bushmaster bite then transitions and you start to gain all these additional symptoms, things such as nausea, vomiting, abdominal colic, which is just like very intense abdominal pain, diarrhea, sweating, hypotension, or basically like your blood pressure lowering significantly, bradycardia, which is like your heart beating slower, going into shock. And then some of these things like the lowering blood pressure and the heart rate and all of that can then lead to other secondary symptoms like dizziness and things like that, because you're not getting enough you're not getting enough blood to your brain. So it's kind of an interesting bite in what I've read, and that initially it almost presents like some other snakes, but then it quickly transitions to having this much more diverse suite of symptoms. And then anti-venom wise, most of the anti-venom in South America and I believe Central America is primarily developed using the various Bothrops species, and it is produced in Brazil and is used extensively on Bushmaster bites, and certainly has saved a lot of people's lives. But I have seen some calls in the medical literature to get a more Bushmaster specific anti-venom. The one thing I'd say is that, you know, Bushmasters aren't encountered anywhere near as much as, like we've talked about, something like a Fertilance. So you know, it's probably a supply and demand thing. And there's just, I mean, there certainly are many Bushmaster bites every year, especially in the Amazon, but but it's just probably not enough of a demand for that at this time. So. Okay, so I want to talk about defensive behavior. Obviously, this is not the tail of a Bushmaster. This is a rattlesnake, but I wanted to show that because to illustrate the point of one of the primary things that a Bushmaster will do if you encounter them. The first thing they will do is they'll kind of have that classic coil, backing up, defensive stance that many of your vipers have. Then they will very vigorously vibrate their tail in the leaf litter, and rattle their tail, making noise. And then sometimes they will kind of arch the front of their body, in kind of a very aggressive manner. And then the last thing that they would do is strike. And as with most vipers, their strike is, I'm assuming, going to be somewhere in about a third to half the length of their body maximum. And that's just if they're really coiled up, like got a good fulcrum behind them. They've got this like maximum kinetic energy. And so, Bushmasters get pretty big, but I always say to get a venomous snake bite, you almost need to touch them, step on them. Bushmasters may have a little more range, but in general, I think they're what I've read, they're much less apt to strike, say, than something like a fertilance. Okay, let's talk a little bit about reproduction, and then we will transition and we'll kind of talk about some of the threats and some of the conservation actions that people are hoping to do in the future. So first thing I'd say, I mentioned in the beginning, we actually know relatively little about Bushmaster ecology, and some of these will be generalizations. And this is somewhat of a generalization, but this will show you the general pattern for reproduction in Bushmasters. They are typically not breeding year-round in the wild. They have this kind of I'll use the Northern Hemisphere terminology, but they have this late winter, early spring breeding season, followed by a oviposition in the summer, and then birthing in the late summer and early fall. And if we think of the breeding, these are obviously not Bushmasters; these are cottonmouths. But you can see these are two snakes involved in kind of a ritualistic combat. And in species that display this type of behavior around breeding, typically males are larger than females within the species. And that is the case within Bushmasters. One, that males do get larger than females, but there also is male-male combat. It is not as maybe I don't know if vigorous is the right word, but it's not as pronounced maybe as some of the vipers like this. I don't think they quite coil all the way into the air. I think there's a lot of dominance play where one male is kind of getting on top of the other and they're pushing each other and maybe coming off the ground a little bit. But there is male-male combat, in relation to the breeding season. With breeding itself, there is a courtship that is very involved, and a lot of snakes have these types of courtships where the male will, say, rub his head on the top of hers or across the back of her body and do different things. And Bushmasters certainly do that. The male has a, kind of a courting ritual that he does the female. And one aspect that's very interesting about that courtship that's been observed is that if you remember those keeled scales I was talking about in the beginning, it has been observed now multiple times that the male will actually invert his body and basically turn part of his body upside down on top of the female and rub those heavily keeled scales on the female. I mean, the assumption being that it's part of the courtship and it, really works to, making her more receptive. And so then, like all snakes in this top diagram, you see right here would be the cloaca. The tail basically starts behind that. And inside the cloaca of the male, there are these paired organs called hemipenes. And this is, so this snake would have another one that would stick out this side, but it currently only has one out. And in Bushmasters, you can see they kind of have these hair-like projections, and they're forked. So there's kind of two forks to each hemipene. And this is basically the sperm delivery system. So after the courtship, if the female is receptive, the male will insert one of the hemipenes into the female's cloaca, and that's how it delivers sperm. And then there is some recent evidence for the idea that Bushmasters may store sperm. So the females may actually store sperm, and they can use that sperm at a later date for fertilizing eggs. But that's I've only seen one note of that, and but we do know it happens quite a bit in some of the other vipers. For example, in the North American rattlesnakes. So I would not be surprised. Then oviposition again occurs in that summer time frame, and this is one of my biologists. We're down in Costa Rica looking for Bushmasters, and you can see he's running essentially a camera down into a burrow, and the Bushmasters typically will lay eggs inside of an existing burrow. And for any of you that know snakes but don't know Bushmasters and heard me say eggs, you might be surprised, but this is the one viper in North America, in the Americas, that lays eggs. So Bushmasters are an egg layer. They lay a relatively small, for a snake their size, relatively small number of eggs. Those eggs are relatively big. And there's different strategies in snakes. You have some snakes that give birth to 80, 100, babies or eggs. And then you have other snakes that go with a small number of large offspring. And Bushmasters are definitely that approach. So again, the female lays eggs typically inside of these existing mammal burrows in the forest, and they lay a relatively small amount of large eggs. And that's an approximate range. Like, it wouldn't surprise me if you had a small female lay 4 eggs or one laid 17 eggs. But in general, that's kind of the general range of where you might see a number of eggs in Bushmasters. The other interesting thing, and this is, you don't see this in a lot of snakes, but that most snakes that lay eggs, they lay their eggs and they just leave the eggs and they go off and go on with their life. But there are a number of snakes that actually lay eggs and guard them. Probably the one that people think of most might be something like a king cobra, some of the other large python type snakes. But Bushmaster females stay in these burrows with these eggs and guard the eggs, and which is fascinating. But even with the live bearing vipers we see in the Americas, there's now really a lot of evidence that the mothers actually have some parental care and spend some time guarding the neonates there too. So it's not really that surprising, but it's an interesting aspect of their ecology. And then lastly, birthing, again, I mentioned in a generalized sense, is typically late summer into the fall. And here you see a young Bushmaster coming out of the egg. We know very few young Bushmasters are seen in the wild, and we know very little about their ecology in the wild. I will say one thing that's kind of interesting, there's been some evidence with the Central American Bushmaster that the venom, as I mentioned, the venom can change over the life of certain animals. And there has been some evidence in the Central American Bushmaster that when the snakes are young, their venom is actually less potent to humans. And then, but relatively quickly, it goes to what we think of as Bushmaster venom. I would say that's not to the kind of a common misconception that a lot of people have, that small, say, rattlesnakes don't have control over how much venom they inject. So people oftentimes think of small, say, baby or very young rattlesnakes as more dangerous because they're automatically going to inject all the venom. But there's a lot of science now coming out that shows that these young rattlesnakes can do that. So it's not due to that. It's actually due to the makeup, the chemical makeup of the venom. It changes over time. At least there's some initial evidence, again, in the Central American Bushmaster. Okay, so that's just kind of an overview of some of what we know about the natural history and ecology of Bushmasters. And I want to bring this presentation in for a landing, and happy to answer any questions. But I want to do that by going back to this forest, because Again, Bushmasters, in my mind, they are a symbol of wilderness. They're a symbol of relatively undisturbed, ecosystems, rainforests that, are functioning relatively well. And so we can't decouple the snake from the forest. And as we start to think about what are those things that are impacting Bushmaster populations, and how a conservation organization like ours can deal with those, it's about the forest primarily. And before we get into that, I do want to make a point. I think when we think about these types of, what's impacting an animal in the wild, we oftentimes forget history. And when we think of, say, the Amazon or some of these rainforests, we think of, these just incredibly wild places that are uninhabited. But there's getting to be more and more evidence that there were a lot of people in some of these places not so long ago. And so these are obviously Mayan ruins that you'd see here that would actually be just slightly outside of the range of Bushmasters. But the point is that there were people throughout Central America, certainly. And we're starting to find that we think there were a lot more people in the Amazon than were initially thought. And we're seeing this in North America too. What we think of as the Native American populations when we arrived are probably actually much, much, much smaller than they were. And that was because, Europeans had contact with the Americas. We may not have been here in force, but there would be a group that came and left. And I've read some estimates that it could have been potentially as high as 80 or 90% of the people in the Americas died. And so, here where I live, for example, we think of the Cherokee Indians, but before that were the Mississippians. And there were an incredible amount of people living in, say, the Tennessee River Valley. Those people died out. And you can imagine if 80 to 90% of a society died, how that would reshuffle and how people would reshuffle. So what does that mean relative to Bushmasters? The point being that in the Amazon and in Central America, they're starting to use LiDAR now. They're starting to find a lot more evidence that there were probably more people than we have thought in these landscapes. And so that just is important as we think about how these animals, what their populations are like currently and what they're going to be like in the future. So the threats to Bushmasters, because they have such a tight link to these undisturbed, relatively old growth type rainforests, are linked to the forest, and they're linked to deforestation in different forms. And if you look at these maps here on the left, you see for South America, you see the original forest cover in the Amazon basin, and then down in those the Atlantic coastal forests. And then you see the current forest cover. And the first thing that should jump out at you is something I mentioned earlier, that these Atlantic coastal forests are almost completely lost. And indeed, there are many, many endangered animals and plants and everything living in that landscape. This is a landscape where there are places that you think of, places like Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, heavily developed area, and a lot of animals having a lot of trouble, including that subspecies of the South American Bushmaster that lives in that landscape. They are still there, but yeah, their future is uncertain. And so what's causing the deforestation? It's diverse, but I would say the primary driver is this slash and burn type agriculture, where people go into the rainforests, they cut down the rainforest, they burn off they log, they take the fiber out, and then they burn the remaining slash, and then they do some form of agriculture there, which is actually a very inefficient use of nutrients, because rainforests, a lot of the nutrients in a rainforest are actually in those trees, and a lot of the soil can actually really not be that productive. And probably the best suited form of agriculture in a cleared rainforest like this would be cattle farming. And cattle farming is the is the dominant activity that comes in after deforestation. So they clear the trees, they pull those out, they burn these areas, and then they put cattle in them. And I've read somewhere that of the agriculture that's in the Amazon basin, about 80% of it is cattle, and it's is spreading, and it's increasing at an increasing rate. And this is fueled by our need for inexpensive meat, and this is not, I mean, this is meat that we are all eating. If you go to Walmart, if you go to some of these fast food places, like the meat that's raised in the Amazon goes out on a global market. The other thing, this is actually a picture from Indonesia of a palm oil farm, but palm oil plantations are increasing in South America, and they're certainly increasing in Central America as well. I've seen a lot of them in Costa Rica, and other forms of agriculture. Soy is also something that is being farmed increasingly in the Amazon basin. And this palm oil craze that's, it's probably having a bigger impact in some ways over in Asia. This is probably going to cause the extinction of orangutans, for example, in all our lifetimes. But this is like, if you eat a diet that has a lot of processed foods, if you go to the grocery store and you buy a lot of things that comes in boxes, and then there's a bag inside of those boxes, you're eating a lot of palm oil. And that, I mean, I'm speaking generally, it's in a lot of condiments and all this stuff, but this palm oil and our need for just cooking oils and, all of that is driving an incredible amount of deforestation in the rainforest as well. Another important impact that doesn't quite have the same footprint as cattle and, again, the growing, things such as oil and soy farming is mining. And I'd say the footprint of most mines are surface mines like this, but it's relatively small. However, I've been to see a couple of these in Peru, and the outside of the actual footprint of the mine, it actually has quite an impact on the forest, just from the people living there and all the infrastructure for that and all the trees they cut down to support the people. And then probably most importantly, when I was there in Peru, people were getting gold dust out of, and they'd have these people, and they'd have mercury in their hand. And somehow they were using mercury in the water on their hands, just right on their hands, to get this gold dust out. I don't remember the exact process, but the point being is that the waterways in a lot of these rainforests in Central and South America are getting heavily polluted in a very direct way by things such as mercury. So it's having a pretty big impact. But the other thing I would say is we're all probably familiar with the forest fires that happened in the Amazon. A lot of this was driven by a pretty dry year, and then driven by this slash and burn agriculture that we talked about. But this is probably going to be an increasing phenomenon as we move forward, and an important part of the deforestation story. Here's just some aerial imagery of some of those fires from the other year, showing the smoke on the landscape. Okay, so the Bushmasters tied to this forest, and if we want to conserve the Bushmaster, we really do need to think about the conservation of the forest and the Bushmaster as one, and dealing with these deforestation issues. And so there's a number of aspects of conservation work that a number of different groups are currently working on, that things that will hopefully be growing, just a diversity of land protection projects. A lot of we really need more understanding of the Bushmaster, what it does, what it needs. So a real research component. And then obviously a lot of this deforestation is driven by policy decisions, by socioeconomic conditions in some of these countries. And so we need to find a way to balance the needs of people and the forest and the Bushmasters, and have have it all kind of work together and have our cake and eat it too, to some degree. A great deal of education on multiple fronts, whether it just be understanding the snake better, so people don't quite have the same level of fear, to lower persecution. But again, I don't think persecution is the primary threat that is not even close to the primary threat that Bushmasters are facing. It's this, it's a deforestation problem. And then along with all of these socioeconomic and education issues, we need better snakebite treatment, especially in rural places where people encounter these. And I really think of that as a strong approach to conserving venomous snakes, if people know that there is treatment. So I put here a conservation alliance. The Oriental Society used to work on Bushmasters a number of years ago, and we had some transitions in the organization and changed some of that. But we're now at a point where we're going to be moving back towards that. And we're just starting to talk to some partners, some which are on this list. But in some of these we haven't talked to, and there are many people that aren't on this list. But point being is that we want to bring together a number of groups that have interest in conserving rare species or conserving wildlife in the rainforest, and begin playing an active role in conserving Bushmasters and the rainforests they depend on. Thank you all for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions that we might have received. Kylie?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. We have a few questions and comments so far. If anybody has anything else they'd like to ask, please enter them into the chat. First, Jens would like to know, did the ranges of L. stenophorus and other Bushmaster species extend farther to the north prior to deforestation?
Yes, so there is, well, that's a good question, but not in recent times. I don't know the extent of the range, say prehistorically, but yes, on that northern edge of the range, they have contracted back towards Costa Rica, but they certainly went beyond the Costa Rican border. But in terms of their distribution, say when native pre-European communities were in Central America, I'm not sure about that. And maybe there's some evidence from fossil record or something like that, but I'm not aware of it if there is. So,
all right, we have a couple questions from Patrick. First, are you aware of any behavioral differences between the Chicoan Bushmasters due to the more arid environment that they live in?
I'm not, but I'm very fascinated by that species. I've never seen them in captivity anywhere. I had a trip to go see them. We were in Ecuador and we were supposed to move up into Colombia, but there was some unrest at the time. For safety reasons, we couldn't go. So I can't answer that, but that's exactly my sentiments and why I want to get into that region. I think of them as probably in the most unique environment of all those different species, and so I'm just very curious to see them, and it'd be interesting to learn more about them. So I'm not answering your question. I'm agreeing with you, saying, great question.
Well, maybe you can answer Patrick's next question, or perhaps not. This is more general to just vipers that have the ambush hunting strategy as a whole, and he's wondering if you know whether they move in a perpendicular direction relative to where they would expect the travel corridors of their prey to be, so they increase their chances of running into their prey scent trails, or are there search patterns how they actually look for their prey scent more random?
Well, so I'd say how they set up and Kylie, you could probably speak to this because you've seen a lot of our timber rattlesnakes in foraging positions, but how they set up is oftentimes would oftentimes be perpendicular to a movement trail. And then in the sense that, they might be setting up on the log example I gave. Yeah, I've also seen them set up on trees, kind of looking up trees, which I guess would be more in parallel to, you would think something's going up and down a tree. But that's not quite getting to your question. I think your question is more about how they move across the landscape to maximize their chances of finding, say, high density. And so I would say the only study that did that. I did some of a similar thing for when I did my PhD. I worked on Great Basin rattlesnakes in Idaho, and I was looking at their forage. I was looking at the snake's ecology relative to prey availability and their movements and their habitats and their reproduction. But there was a study prior to mine that found the same type of thing, and this was in Wyoming with prairie rattlesnakes. And what they found is that the snakes leave their overwintering site. They might have they might shed near the den site. That's pretty common with a lot of rattlesnake species, in the vicinity of the den site. And then they leave, and they make these very migration-like movements, very linear. And what this study did in Wyoming is that they had mammal trapping going along with the snake, so following the snake through the landscape. And what they found was that the snakes changed their movements significantly when they hit areas of high mammal abundance, whatever it might be. When their mammal traps started increasing, they would see the snakes set up and do completely different movements. And I saw the same thing in Great Basins. That still does not completely answer your question, except to say that in what we now know, 2 different species of rattlesnakes in the West, their strategy was to make very linear, long distance, fast movements until they came into areas of high prey density. In terms of whether that was parallel to primary movement corridors, I don't know. So I'm not able to answer that question, but that's to the best of our knowledge on that.
That is reminding me a lot of the movement strategies of my Roomba that moves around the room at random. So it's a patch of dirt, and then it starts circling to cover the area really well. Science following nature, or inventions rather. So Daryl has a couple questions. One, how large is the genetic variation between the fer-de-lance, hognose vipers, and bushmasters?
Among them, I can't answer that. I could point you in the right direction on that, but what did you say? The hognose, the fer-de-lance,
and the bushmasters.
Yeah, I don't even want to speak. I have an idea, but I'm not read up enough on the taxonomy and the genetics outside of how the bushmasters within the vipers to answer that accurately. But there are a number of studies that I could point you to. So,
all right. And Daryl was also wondering if there's a big difference in the characteristics of the venom between the different bushmaster species in terms of how they affect the body or how potent they are.
Mm-hmm. I haven't. So there have been a couple studies that look at the differences among the species and did not, from what I remember, did not see significant differences. The bigger differences were between the, like I was saying, within the Central American, between the young and the older individuals. As they grew, their venom composition changed. But, excuse me, they weren't finding great differences among the species, but they weren't looking at all the species. And I can't remember. I know it was Stenophrys or the Central American. I think they might have been comparing it to, I want to say, to the black-headed, and maybe definitely not the Chicoan, maybe the South American. But in that study, the one study that I've seen that shows that, study that, there was not a significant difference between the species.
Yeah, and just following up, do you think, maybe this is speculative, that might have anything to do with their changes in prey as they move from a teeny tiny little snake to a giant one?
Yeah, you would think so, obviously, and you see that in other species. But it's interesting because bushmasters, at least based on what we know, again, we don't know a great deal about them, but like they still primarily stay with mammals. There are a number of examples of vipers that might start out when they're young, be eating more like frogs and invertebrates of some type, and then they become mammal eaters, and their venom changes with that transition.
All right, and we had a note from James saying that at some point he'd invited Steve, I'm assuming he means Steve Spear, to Costa Rica several years ago to look for bushmasters on a friend's property, and just adding that they're still there in the secondary forest. So perhaps if we have a chance to get back out there, there may be a connection there.
I will be going to Costa Rica probably twice in the next year. So so yeah, you can reach out to me. I'd love to connect.
All right. And Sebastian is asking if there's any information on population sizes for the different Bushmaster species.
No, there is. They're very.
I have a feeling that might be a no.
There are very few places where populations are being studied in depth. So there was one on the Caribbean side. I mentioned Harry Green's study, but still he wasn't able to get population estimates there. There is currently a lot of research going on the Pacific side of the in Costa Rica. With that, I put their logo up there, the Bushmaster Conservation Project. Everybody should check that out. They're doing good work. Get on there, donate, help them out. And I'm assuming they're working towards some of that, but I don't know of any population level work that's looked at anything such as survival, population estimates. And again, this is really an understudied species. For one, it's an incredibly hard species to find. I mean, it really can be difficult to encounter. I know there are places that people consistently see them, but it is one of the snake species that we know relatively little about. So I do not know of a place. I cannot imagine. I don't know if we'd ever be able to get to a point where we'd be able to have some type of accurate population estimate. Maybe at best we could come up with some like coarse, like abundance per hectare or something like that. But getting accurate population estimates and doing that type of modeling, I don't know if it's even possible. So.
All right, we have a couple more questions, then we'll probably wrap things up. First, another one from Patrick, just noting that it looks like on range maps, stenofreeze does occur on some islands in Panama, and he's just wondering if those island populations are any different from the ones on the mainland.
I don't think we know much about them, but they do, and they also occur in Trinidad, across on the Caribbean side. So they do occur on islands, but those, one thing I know about those islands, because there's a lot of spiny rat research on a lot of the Panamanian islands, that they're forested rainforest environments, similar prey. I would be surprised if there were major differences in their ecology. Maybe if the prey populations were different, you might see maybe some size difference, but I don't know, or maybe if there are climate differences, maybe some effects on reproduction. And I'm not trying to, with these questions, I'm not trying to be elusive. If we were talking about timber rattlesnakes, I could be like boom, 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 but we just don't know. And that's when we really don't. There's a lot about these species we don't know. So.
All right, and one more. This is an interesting one, and in South America, the areas where these snakes occur, there's a lot of conflict between some of the different countries. And Daryl is wondering if those conflicts impact research on these species.
Well, I mean, from the bigger picture, I mean, the conflicts and how it's affecting communities and the resources needed are certainly impacting the deforestation rate. So that's, I see the stability. That's why I mentioned policy and socioeconomics. A lot of that stuff is the key to conserving these species, making sure people can be making a living without having to cut down, excessive amounts of new rainforest every day. But in terms of say conflict coming head to head with people doing research and causing impacts, I have not heard of that with Bushmasters. Again, there's a small number of people working with them, but it certainly has happened a number of times. I know multiple people working on different species in Mexico, for example. Again, not Bushmasters, obviously, but that their research and projects have been impacted. So I certainly think it has the potential there, and maybe there is somebody that I don't know about, but yeah, I mean, the Bushmaster obviously covers a number of its ranges into a number of different countries that have different governments, and there's different issues in each country, and so yeah, certainly conflicts could impact. I told you we were going on an expedition to look for the Chicoa, and then we couldn't go into the country at that point because it just wasn't safe because of something that had happened a couple of days prior. So
Great. Well, that is all we have for questions. I don't think I missed anybody. Well, thank you so much, Chris. I know it's not like I'm a rookie when it comes to Vipers, but I learned a lot from your presentation. I hope that everybody else here did as well. And if people would like to follow up and they have more questions that they think of later, you can certainly reach out over social media or however you found out about this webinar would be a good way to get in touch with the Orion Society, and we will try to get an answer for you.
Great. Well, thank you to everybody. I really appreciate you spending some time with me, and happy World Snake Day.